Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. Today is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So perhaps some of my viewers weren't alive at the time. So it was the 11th of September 2001. Of course, Americans put the month first and then the day of it. So what happened? Well, it's a day of infamy. It's the day of the World Trade Tower attacks. So Al Qaeda, that means the base in Arabic, this organization founded by Osama bin Laden. He was originally a Saudi Arabian, but had lost his citizenship, exiled in Sudan, later in Afghanistan. His organization, they launched these attacks in the United States. There were, I think it's 19 hijackers, one French Tunisian, the other Saudi Arabians. And they had been in the United States for a few months. Some of them had been in the West for several years, spoke flawless English. One had been studying in Hamburg, Germany. And they'd learned how to take off planes, very easy to train to be a private pilot. But one of them aroused suspicion, Zacharias Moussaoui, saying, no, and I don't want to know how to land. Why would he not want to know how to land? There was various chatter in Al Qaeda. The FBI and the CIA were listening in. They had their informants. Perhaps they had listening devices, but it was imprecise. Some sort of major attack on some American interest, which didn't necessarily mean somewhere in the United States, could be abroad. Remember, 3 years earlier, there had been the East Africa embassy bombings. But anyway, that morning, flights heading out of New York City, planes were hijacked because security is very lax in the United States in the 90s. I went to the US in the 90s once, and getting on a plane was not much different from getting on a bus at the airport. Turn up as little as 20 minutes before the plane flew off, and security checks were actually not very strict. Carrying knives onto a plane was seen as entirely unobjectionable. Remember, your right to bear arms shall not be abridged, although people weren't allowed to carry guns onto planes. Anyway, so at some point in the flight, some of these men stood up, got out their box cutter knives, and threatened air hostesses and so on, knives to the throat, and said to the pilot, "You open the door of the cockpit, or we're going to cut a throat." So he did, and then they'd taken over the plane. I mean, presumably they killed the pilot at that point. But one of them, I can't remember his name, he got on the intercom system, spoke to the passenger, say, "This is your captain speaking, please remain calm, remain in your seats, nothing to worry about, we're flying on as normal." Anyway, and so they flew into the World Trade Center. First of all, people thought, was it an accident or what? But clearly it was not. So it was only about 9:30 in the morning that this happened. And then there was United 93, that plane they were trying to fly into was at the White House, and the passengers decided to fight back, storm the cockpit, at which point the pilot deliberately crashed it, killing everyone on board. So they hadn't been able to save themselves. He'd at least killed quite a few Americans, which was a coup from Al Qaeda's point of view. It crashed something into the Pentagon, didn't actually cause that much damage. So the president at the time was George W. Bush, been elected the previous November, taken office obviously the 20th of January, in a very close contentious election. He'd lost the popular vote by 0.5% and won really by one vote in the Supreme Court, as well as a few hundred hanging chads in Dade County, Florida. But had not particularly high approval rating, was meant to be a domestic policy president, largely indifferent to foreign policy. He'd only been abroad twice in his life, and suddenly was thrust onto the world stage as someone who had to pay great attention to foreign policy. He was at some school listening to the children have a story about a goat read to them, and a Secret Serviceman came up and whispered into his ear what had happened, and you see the look come over his face, the fury and the look of resolve, like. But he sat there for a couple of minutes before he was whisked away. He hadn't decided, well, action stations, sorry kids, but higher priorities beckoned. Anyway, he was taken to some secret location. So was Vice President Dick Cheney, who recalled the Secret Service are not courteous at these times, say, "Sir, we have to go," and just carry him down the corridor to, and I don't know, wherever secret location, what bunker they have for him. That was it. All flights were grounded, and it was panic stations initially. I was in Vietnam at the time, in Ho Chi Minh City. I was sitting in an internet cafe looking up the news, and my cousin said to me, "Hey, some planes just crashed into the World Trade Tower in New York." And I assumed it to be an accident. I mean, planes crash from time to time, and then it became clear what the news was. And people said some of the Vietnamese were elated, were applauding. I didn't see that myself, because remember, only 26 years earlier, obviously, the United States had been fighting in Vietnam, and as many Vietnamese would say, that millions of Vietnamese were killed. Not just millions of military personnel, but at least hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed by Americans and American-backed forces, really from 1945 up to about 1975. You might say the Americans were on the right side in that conflict, but anyway, there were certainly Vietnamese who suffered because of them. And anyway, I had to fly out of Bangkok a few days later, a bit worried, would they let me on the plane? But actually, nothing untoward happened. It wasn't even that difficult getting on. But I thought, what if someone tries to hijack this plane? We're going to have to fight. I mean, I'm an utter caitiff, but knavish though I am, I would only fight for my own survival, because that would be your only hope of taking them on, even if you're unarmed. Anyway, nothing happened. And then in London, boarding another flight to Ireland, and some man was saying, "Oh, sir, may I search you, blah, blah, blah. You're told to arrive at the airport 3 hours ahead." You could still take liquids onto planes. It wasn't about 2006 people had figured out that some terrorists had hit on the ingenious plan that this chemical is innocuous, that chemical is innocuous, but mixed together they're explosive, which is why you can take very little by way of liquid onto planes. Anyway, so that was 9/11. And that the World Trade Tower was knocked down. First of all, it was reported that tens of thousands of people had been killed. It turned out to be not quite 3,000 people had been killed. George W. Bush said the world changed. Now, Robert Fisk, this British journalist who's famously very anti-American in his views. Okay, he's not against American people, but let's say, all right, anti-US policy, I could say. And he said, well, come on, this is not the first time 3,000 people have been killed in one day. Far, far more people have been killed in one day on many occasions, sometimes by America's allies. So why should the world suddenly change and all civil liberties be shredded because of this? So anyway, Osama bin Laden, he was in Afghanistan, had been sheltered there by the Taliban, which then as now ruled virtually the whole country, but weren't legally recognised as the government. So George W. Bush asked that he be extradited, he be handed over. They refused to do so. So he was going to take action. So in about a month, the US went into military action. Colin Powell, was the Secretary of State, as in Foreign Minister, he'd phoned President Pervez Musharraf of Pakistan saying, "You cooperate with us now, or be bombed back to the Stone Age." So America was in a tizzy of blind rage, and the Pakistanis knew it. This was not a time to quibble. If they didn't, they really were going to be hammered by Uncle Sam. The terrible swift sword had been unsheathed, and so they went into Afghanistan. Now, Bush Jr. had been famously disdainful of the very idea of nation building, but he was convinced it was necessary. NATO, the United States obviously is a founder member of NATO, invoked that article of the NATO Charter saying an attack on one member state is an attack on all, you must spring to our aid. And so all the other NATO countries came to America's aid, and they fought alongside the United States in Afghanistan, including Turkey, the only Muslim majority member state of NATO. And then obviously led on to Iraq, but I won't get into that. So it was an epoch-making moment. The war on terror began, a conflict which is probably not quite over despite the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It sort of was a bit of a paradigm shift. The United States were not terribly interested in the Middle East. Okay, they wanted to get oil. They were Israel's banker and armourer. But Bill Clinton in '98 said long-term goal of regime change in Iraq, but they weren't going to launch any ground invasion there. The United States was completely indifferent to what was going on with Afghanistan. Some Americans even advocated recognizing the Taliban in order to get a pipeline built across Afghanistan, which is maybe finally going ahead now. Fairly indifferent to Pakistan, some military aid. Policy was shifting a bit towards India. The Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee been very well received in the United States in 1999. Some Americans say, should we just dump Pakistan? I mean, they're worthless to us. And clearly, India is a far more important and a more attractive partner, economically speaking, and as it's democratic and all the rest of it. That wasn't to happen. And because of this concentration on the Middle East for the last 20 years, the United States obviously disregarded the Far East. Obama tried more of a pivot towards Asia-Pacific, not much success there. Africa was largely disregarded, as indeed was Latin America, and that's why the Chinese have been able to buy up so much of Africa over the past 2 decades. Anyway, that's my penny's worth, and we still feel the repercussions to this day. Some of the abridgments of civil liberty in the United States, or those people who were captured in Afghanistan, called battlefield detainees, held in Guantanamo, some of them to this day without trial. So they're not seen as prisoners of war. They're not processed and tried in the ordinary way you would someone who's suspected of a crime. They're in this terrible limbo. So it was really quite scandalous. It's gone on for so long. And then that's taken a measure of toughness, how much you can abrogate America's own tradition of liberty by depriving people of rights, the presumption of innocence and the right to a fair trial. That's seen as like virtuous, as patriotic for some American politicians to betray their own country's legal heritage. That's by Pennyworth on 9/11. Toodle pip.